we had a great teach-in last night in D.C., and there's going to be several actions following up. Starting today, there was a sit-in. Has anybody heard of the sit-in today? No? There was a sit-in at Senator Pelosi's office, and there will be, tomorrow there will be a demonstration. I guess there's some actions in Baltimore, but if you're in D.C., there's going to be a demonstration at noon, starting from the White House and going into Congress, into Capitol Hill. So I wanted to introduce Rania. I'll say a couple of personal things first. I met Rania when the U.S. was committing one of its greatest moral obscenities, and that is the sanctions against Iraq, which, as some of you might know, resulted in the death of 500,000 Iraqi children. And Madeleine Albright in 60 Minutes had declared that it was worth it. That's what a moral obscenity is, not what Kerry is painting out and lying about. Well, also I've worked with Rania on United for Peace and Justice, and I'll give you just the rundown, the obligatory rundown of all she's done. She's a human rights activist and environmental scientist. Since 2005, she's been a professor, as Ryan mentioned, at the University of Balamand in Lebanon. Before moving to Lebanon in 2005, she was the director of the Southern Peace Research and Education Center at the Institute for Southern Studies in North Carolina. Her publications have included studies on environmental justice, human rights, and particularly the U.S. war on Iraq. Since 1995, she has spoken in hundreds of speaking engagements throughout the U.S. and Canada, and in Puerto Rico, France, Italy, Belgium, Brazil, Japan, India, Spain, and Lebanon. She served as an expert in the Court of Conscience on the Israeli 2006 war on Lebanon, during which she presented expert testimony on the environmental impact of the Israeli war on Lebanon. And Rania is in several trenches. First, she's in the electoral trench. Today alone, she went and visited 9 representatives of Congress, right? There was 9? 13 representatives, but she's also in the real trenches on the grassroots level and here and in Lebanon. So I'd like to introduce Rania Masri.
Thanks for everybody for coming out, and thanks for introducing me to Baltimore. I don't believe I've been this far north, so I appreciate the visit. We're all here because we're unified in opposition to this so-called limited and narrow military strike in response to a red line that's been crossed because of a moral obscenity that's been committed that cannot be allowed, because then there would be an international precedent and international norms would be broken. That's basically the framing of the conflict in a nutshell. That's what Obama, Secretary of State Kerry, y'all know all the war hawks, the alleged doves. This is the framing that we've been presented. Red line, moral outrage, chemical weapons, so on and so forth. We know that. I'm not going to go into it. I don't think there's any, is there anybody here who feels conflicted about, let me rephrase this. Is there anybody here who believes that the United States has credibility to talk about chemical weapons usage? Exactly. Is there anybody here who believes the United States has legitimacy to talk about chemical weapons usage, which are two separate things? So, We're in agreement, we all recognize that the United States has not only supported and funded the use of chemical weapons in the Middle East specifically, but has also specifically used chemical weapons in Iraq in the form of white phosphorus. I'm not even going to get into depleted uranium because that's controversial as to whether or not depleted uranium constitutes a chemical weapon. But we know that white phosphorus is a chemical weapon, and that the toxic legacy of the use of white phosphorus in Fallujah, in Iraq, has been greater than the toxic legacy of the use of both atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And note, I'm talking toxic legacy. That means I'm not talking about the number of fatalities. In no way am I minimizing the horror and the war crimes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. I'm talking about the aftermath, the consequences of the use of that chemical weapon in Iraq. So we all know the United States has no credibility on this issue. Where I think there becomes difficulty in presentation is the way that the U.S. administration has so successfully framed this conflict. They have framed it using a number of different figures and presenting it in such a way as to make our framing of it all the more difficult. They've claimed that 100,000 people have been killed by the Syrian regime. And this is a number that has been presented first by the Syrian Human Rights Observatory, which is a pro-opposition source, that said approximately 100,000 people have been killed in Syria. Maybe the number is as high as 120,000 as stated by NATO. The number of 100,000 was back in June of this year. The United States administration took that number with the support of the mainstream press, including The Guardian in England, and presented it as 100,000 people have been killed by the murderous thug of the Syrian regime. If that's the case, that 100,000 people have been killed by the Syrian regime, then there is no armed opposition, because then no Syrian soldiers have been killed. Then all the 100,000 people have been Syrian civilians. According to the very same pro-opposition Syrian Human Rights Observatory, 43% of the 100,000 fatalities are actually Syrian army combatants. And I think it's very important to raise this as an issue. Another 14% are actually armed rebel combatants, according again to this pro-opposition source. Now, Syrian Human Rights Observatory defines an armed combatant that is separate from the Syrian army as any individual who has defected from the Syrian army and then picked up weapons. Now, any individual who has picked up weapons without having defected from the Syrian army and died in the process is defined as a civilian according to the Syrian Human Rights Observatory. And therefore, the number of 43% remaining of the 100,000 being civilians is up for question, because international law defines civilian as an unarmed individual. I'm raising this simply to present the issue in focus, not to minimize the horrors that have been committed by the Syrian regime, but to recognize that they do not have a monopoly on war crimes committed in Syria. Absolutely, they do not have a monopoly on the war crimes committed in Syria or on the atrocities that have been committed against the Syrian people. The biggest atrocity, I argue, beyond this huge number of fatalities, and I mourn for every Syrian that has been killed. And for the record, I do not mourn for the foreigners who are fighting in Syria and happen to die. I don't mourn for them. And we can talk about that later. But I do mourn for every single Syrian who has been killed. But one third of all Syrians are right now displaced. 1/3 of all Syrians, 2 million of whom now have been displaced outside their homes in refugee camps, either in Jordan, and the refugee camp in Jordan is in such, it really can't be called a refugee camp. It's more akin to large-scale tents in the middle of the desert, separated from basic infrastructure, set up in such a way that when the so-called Free Syrian Army goes there, they can easily recruit teenagers to go and fight across the border into Syria and then return to those camps. And that is the case as reported by the United Nations. So we have 2 million that are spread between Jordan, between militarized refugee camps in Turkey, between non-existent camps in Lebanon, and also then they've spread as far as Egypt and Sudan. The remaining 4 million are internally displaced within Syria. And that number is growing every day at a tune of 6,000 to 8,000 daily. The numbers are really horrific, and the numbers of refugees have increased in response to US threats of bombing out of love. So we have this framing of the number, and I'm raising it again because it's important to put into context. And when we talk about numbers, there's another number that's really driving me nuts. And when I raised this discrepancy to Congress, I got one staff person who told me, yeah, so what? So I'm hoping y'all don't give me the same reaction, because to me it's quite stunning. The number we've been told by President Obama, Secretary of State John Kerry, Senator McCain, all these loving people, is that 1,400 people were killed in the chemical attack in Ghouta in Syria. 1,400 people. And they keep repeating, I mean, Obama said this today in a press conference, actually he was quoted on this today, that 1,000 women and children were killed in Ghouta. These are big numbers. Now, it's ironic that, again, the pro-opposition Syrian Human Rights Observatory claims that the number killed in Ghouta is actually 505 fatalities. So we're talking about a discrepancy of almost 1,000. That's a huge discrepancy. But now that Obama has stated it time and time and time again, it has become almost fact. It's been repeated verbatim by mainstream press throughout this country and beyond, to the point that when I raised it with Congress today, with a few congressional aides, the response was, well, yeah, what's your point? And I said, my point is, if they're willing to lie about such an issue, how can you trust them on anything else? How can we trust them on anything else related to the dossier that they have presented to Congress? If they're willing to lie about fatalities, about a lie they didn't need, they could have simply said 500 people have been killed. That's a moral outrage in and of itself. They didn't need to add another 900 some figures. Or maybe they did. Because back in June of this year was the first time that President Obama declared that the Syrian government crossed a red line. We all remember back in June of this year, President Obama declared that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons, quote, albeit on a small scale, and therefore the United States needs to start officially arming the rebels. He didn't get the necessary support, the necessary sense of outrage from Congress. Somehow the next time around the number became 1,400 rather than 500. There's a larger framing of this issue that's been presented to us, and unfortunately even Noam Chomsky has fallen for this framing, which is that we have an uprising in Syria that began 2.5 years ago, a revolution, internal uprising. People took to the streets out of, inspired by the revolutions in Tunis, the revolutions in Egypt, and they took to the streets. The Syrian regime responded with its typical level of brutality. The communities then picked up arms, and thereby we had an armed uprising which has since then escalated into a civil war. That's one framing. Unfortunately, it's not supported by historical accuracy. It's not supported by what's actually happened on the ground for two reasons. Let's start with the uprising that began in March of 2011. Yes, it did begin as an internal uprising. Yes, the regime did respond with brutality. Those two are facts that are clear. But this concept that those same individuals that were protesting, that were then brutalized, were the ones that picked up weapons and became the Free Syrian Army, that is the falsehood. That is what is not supported by facts on the ground. Absolutely, that is not supported for two reasons. The Free Syrian Army was actually a foreign construct. It was a construct supported and designed and funded by the United States and its allies, primarily by the Turks. So we have this whole concept of the Free Syrian Army that was used also, this concept that we've got an army with a clear hierarchy composed of people that have defected from the Syrian army itself. It raises fervor. It means that they're good, honest men, all men, so I don't mean this as a gender bias, they are all men. They're good, honest men that we can then stand behind because this is an internal armed uprising, all cool. Not quite. We have that up for question. More fundamentally is this idea that the arms themselves came from within. The main funding and design of the arms and support came from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey via Jordan and Lebanon. Okay. Not to say that they weren't then joined by individuals who felt so disenfranchised and so rejected by the brutality of the Syrian regime that they then chose to pick up arms. That happened. But it was not an internal design. The internally created, the non-violent civil society uprising, yes, that is Syrian-born and Syrian-bred. The others isn't. And to fully understand what I mean by that, we need to go back to the essence of the framing of the issue by the administration, which is this conflict began in March 2011, and we have stood by and have done nothing as the Syrian regime brutalized, as extremist forces have entered, as terrorist organizations have entered and transformed Syria into what is known and has been published in mainstream media, what has become, and I quote, the international breeding ground for terrorists. These are according to State Department intelligence records, so on and so forth. This is how it's being framed now, and because the United States has done nothing, because the United States has done little, because we did not support the right people, and by we, please forgive me, I mean them in Congress and White House, and not us. Okay. Consequently, we're at the situation that we're at now. That's also not supported by fact, because the United States has been involved in Syria for quite a while. They have been involved. And so when we sit here and we say no to military intervention, we should have said no to military intervention back more than a decade ago. Now the slogan is not no to military intervention. Now the slogan is we want to end U.S. military intervention, and we want to stop it from becoming a full-blown war zone, led and funded and supported by the United States. Actually, correction, not funded by the United States, possibly funded by the Saudis. That's a whole other issue that we'll talk about. I want to give you all just a few dates. Back in 2001, a classified plot was revealed to United States Army General Wesley Clark that the United States plans to attack and destroy the governments of 7 nations: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Iraq, check. Libya, check. Somalia, double check. Sudan, check. Oh, and another success story, because the Sudanese government not only has been broken, but Sudan itself has been broken into 2. So ongoing, we have Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. This was a statement back from 2011, building on an earlier statement from 1991 led by Paul Wolfowitz, who was then Undersecretary of Defense. So from at least 2011, if not from 1991, there's been this plan. And if we start to remember, back then, Syria was regarded as the so-called axis of evil. And if we hear the Senate hearings and the discussions that have been going on in Congress, we see that one of the reasons that a lot of the war hawks are pushing for a war on Syria has little to do with Syria and a lot to do with Iran. They're being very upfront about that in Congress. So one, that was in 2011. 2002, the U.S. expands the axis of evil to include Syria. 2005, and I'm just going to list the highlights here. 2005, the Bush administration advisor, who unfortunately is a Lebanese American. We have traitors in every country. A Bush administration advisor says, and I quote, "Both the Syrian and Lebanese regimes will be changed whether they like it or not, whether it's going to be a military coup or something else, and we're working on it. We know already exactly who's going to be the replacements. We're working on it with the Bush administration." This was published in 2005. 2006, we have the Israeli war against Lebanon that is presented in the mainstream media as an Israeli war against Hezbollah, only because the military objectives of that war was to destroy Hezbollah, a war that, this was the second time Israel was defeated in Lebanon. And this is what's really important to understand, because Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah made this very clear several times throughout this year in his speeches, that one of the main supporters for Hezbollah to beat Israel's military objectives in that 33 days of carnage imposed on Lebanon was the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime actually produced some of the weaponry that Hezbollah used, and the Syrian regime was quite a bridge and access for additional supplies that came in. It is a question whether Hezbollah and thereby the Lebanese resistance movement could have actually succeeded in that war that was imposed upon us in 2006, were it not for the Syrian regime. And this is information that has been revealed this year. In 2007, Seymour Hersh wrote in the New Yorker that the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia and particular political parties in Lebanon, as well as the Syrian arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, were assembling, arming, training, and heavily funding a sectarian extremist front, many of whom have direct ties to Al-Qaeda, with the aim to unleash them in both Lebanon and Syria, with the goal being to create and exploit a divide between Sunnah and Shia Muslims. All of this was stated back in 2007, and I can go into it in a lot more detail, but the reason I'm presenting this is there's this false cadre that this is a conflict that began 2 years ago, that this is a conflict that maybe the United States only participated in by officially training the so-called rebels in military bases in Jordan back from December 2012, because that's the information that we've been given by the mainstream media. We do a little bit more research, though, and we discover, as has been published in the Washington Post, that JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, has actually been in operation in Syria since 2003. And the problem with JSOC is there's no congressional oversight. It operates directly under a president, meaning that since 2003 it's operated under a few presidents. All we know about JSOC is their MO. And their MO is they assassinate, they kidnap, they torture, they interrogate. So the big question is, who have they been doing this to, and with whose approval and under whose specific authority in Syria since 2003? I don't know. Maybe they've actually been working with the Syrian regime, maybe against the Syrian regime, I don't know. But we have gone beyond the stage of saying no to US military intervention in Syria. Our government, our army, our covert agencies have already been, quote, intervening in Syria since at least 2003, with a plan that was designed since at least 2001. Which then brings us, well, what do we do about this now? We do have a situation in Syria where, yes, there are pockets of a revolution. There are pockets of an internal uprising. Yes. There are also pockets of a civil war. Yes. And there are also pockets of a proxy war. Very much so. We have all of these going on. And when we talk about a proxy war, what typically reaches the mainstream press is that Hezbollah is involved in Syria. And for myself and for many others who have studied the region, who have lived in the region, who consider the region to be part of our blood, I believe that Hezbollah's actions have been the only predictable action for Hezbollah to take. They were the very last foreign agency to be involved in Syria, literally the very last involvement. Now we can question their involvement strategically, ethically, politically, etc., but we need to recognize that they were the very last to be involved. Among the very first to be involved were the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Americans, if not the Turks or the Israelis. If not, they could all have been involved. So we definitely have a proxy war. Some of us even consider this another Cold War that is under operation in Syria. We have all of these being in fact. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave us both as Americans, and more fundamentally, where does that leave us as people of conscience who believe that every community and every people around the world have the right, the intrinsic right, to have accurate and honest representation in however way that they choose, and to live free of economic and political and military violence? I believe we all agree on that basis. Where does that then leave us? And I think it leaves us with several fronts. We need to be quite loud, quite organized, quite effective in screaming no to this war, because it is a war. And no matter how much, and if y'all heard Secretary of State Kerry at the hearings, he struck me as a man of faith. And I mean that in the true sense of the word. He's a man of faith because he predicated most every statement that he gave at the hearings with, I believe, not I know, not I have information that, not it is accurate that, but I believe. He ended his statement in the hearing with, I believe this is not a war. It reminded me of some colleagues of mine who said, I don't believe in climate change. My response was, it doesn't make a difference whether or not you believe in climate change, it's here. The same applies here. Whether or not Secretary of State John Kerry considers this to be a war or not, what the United States is discussing in Congress is a declaration of a war. And if President Obama does go forward without congressional approval, it would be an impeachable offense. An impeachable offense, in my eyes, that's way greater than having sex with an intern while married. Way greater. And I mean that from a constitutional perspective, which again, it's odd that Obama is a constitutional lawyer. So that becomes one big aspect to recognize. Now, one of the issues that we've been hearing when we're doing these organizings, and during my meetings with Congress, I've heard this a lot, which is, then you're telling us to do nothing while we have the brutality of this regime, which is true. Are you telling us to do nothing and to sit back and to see more and more Syrians being displaced and being made into refugees and more of Syria being destroyed? My answer is absolutely not. I'm not telling you to do nothing. I'm telling you to do something positive rather than something that is so negative that would not only guarantee the killing of Syrians, but would potentially launch a regional war. And in my opinion, actually, bombing of Syrian military capabilities may strengthen the Syrian regime politically, emotionally, morally, but would weaken the Syrian regime militarily. And I'm not sure this is the best time to do so. Well, for the record, I don't believe we have the right to do so. We do not have the legitimacy to do so in any way, shape, or form. But at this stage, with a weakened Syrian military army, I believe we are guaranteed further horrendous crimes and atrocities that would be committed. Because when we look at the armed opposition groups, and I'm going to use the conservative numbers presented by John Kerry, he presented the number of 15% of them. Only 15% of them are terrorists. Using the US definition of terrorist, and not my definition of terrorist, their definition of terrorist, which means people who have gone on record as to believe that if you do not pray in the very specific manner that I pray, then I have the right to kill you in however manner I choose fit. And I won't go into the details of their killing or of the details of their particular brand of religion, which is truly blasphemous to every man and woman of faith. Those armed groups, many of whom are being led by people from Chechnya, not even by Syrians, by people from Chechnya. And we know this because people on the ground tell us these folks don't even speak Arabic. These armed opposition groups, these radicals, these groups that I refuse to call jihadis because I believe it's an affront to the word jihad, these groups that are more accurately called takfiris, because that is the Arabic word for I consider you to be a religious heathen and therefore I am allowed to slaughter you. That's what the word means in Arabic. Those are the groups that are also the most courageous and the strongest and the most well-equipped of the armed groups. Those are the ones committing suicide missions. Those are the ones that have attacked Ma'lula in the past 2 days, which is one of the most ancient Christian villages in the region and one of the remaining Christian villages that actually speaks the language of Jesus Christ. They were the ones that attacked that village, and that village was only protected by the Syrian army. And when I say this, I hear voices in the back of my head going, great, now you're going to be accused of loving Bashar al-Assad. Add that on the list of other accusations I've been given, because 10 years ago I was accused of being in bed with Saddam Hussein, so I'll just add it onto the list. And I think we need to create a framing that allows us to dissect this issue and contextualize this issue and reject this binary of either we accept their framing or we become a pro-dictator. No. I am neither in support of the Syrian government, most definitely am not in support of the bombing. I abhor to my core these Takfiri opposition groups, and at the same time, I vehemently believe, both ethically, politically, and historically, that violence only begets violence. We know this in Lebanon. The civil war has not ended, it's just been put on pause. I'm sure I mean, even in the States, I've talked to friends of mine who are sons and daughters of the Confederates, being a North Carolinian, and they're still angry at the Civil War. Okay? And I'm not saying this to fight for sides, I'm saying this to talk about how much violence, once you feel it, once you experience it, it's really hard. A revolution fought through violent means against one's own brethren is not a revolution that can be built in a holistic, nationalistic sense. It is a revolution that would be unethical and quite bloody and quite difficult. That's my own opinion. We can talk about the Spanish Revolution later, but I don't believe in violence against one's own. So clearly no to this. What are we saying yes to? What are we saying yes to here? What are we saying yes to as people of conscience? And I believe very much that we are actually saying yes to a political settlement and a diplomatic settlement. And saying yes to the United States using its powers, of which it has significant powers throughout the world. It has significant powers to twist certain arms. And it can definitely push people to the negotiating settlement. And what makes this all the more abhorrent is that both Kerry and Secretary of Defense Hagel have gone on record several times as saying this can only end with a diplomatic settlement, this can only end with a political settlement. And of course what they're trying to do is destroy the Syrian army and the Syrian regime to such a situation that once they get to the negotiating table, they'll be so broken they'll agree to foreign commands. I'm not a supporter of that concept. I'm a supporter of trying to minimize human loss and trying to maximize human life. And thereby we push for political settlement sooner rather than later. And one of the ways to get that political settlement is to halt the arms trade, which means get the Saudis and Qataris to stop arming and supporting particularly the Takfiris in Syria. And that can be done through certain political powers within this country. And it can be done if we raise the voices loud enough. Thirdly, and most fundamentally, which is again absurd, given that they're talking about wanting to launch a bombing campaign because they are outraged that people have been killed under a chemical weapons attack, but they're not outraged that 1/3 of all Syrians are in desperate need of humanitarian aid, monies that the United States has not given them, but monies that it can somehow find for a bombing campaign to save them. This is a ludicrousy that we can easily deconstruct. And we can easily respond when people tell us what we can do with, hey, humanitarian programs, humanitarian aid to the refugees that desperately need them. They just released a statement yesterday by the United Nations saying they're about to run out of money for support of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. This is here, it's present, it's now. That is one way that we can be in solidarity with our brethren in Syria. One way. Another way that we can be in solidarity with them is to promote the internal indigenous, non-violent movements that are happening in Syria. And there's two kinds of an internal opposition in Syria. There's the internal opposition external to the government, and there's the internal opposition internal to the government. And that may sound kind of difficult for us to understand, because it is difficult to first grasp. The first internal opposition is the kind that Leila spoke about, those committees, those community organizations. And I stress, they are non-violent and they operate in a number of different factions. The second kind of internal opposition is actually led by Ali Haidar, who is, right now, he has been placed Minister of National Reconciliation in Syria. He's a long-standing opposer to the Syrian government who has taken that role to try to bring all Syrians together to the negotiating table. And he has said time and time again, if you are a Syrian, regardless what weapons you may or may not carry, you are welcome on the negotiating table. If you're not a Syrian, what are you doing? You have no business being here. So there's these two kinds of internal opposition, and those are the kinds I think that we need to emphasize and strengthen. I also believe fundamentally that we here, I'm specifically speaking as Americans, as members of the left, of the progressives, of the anarchists, however way we want to identify themselves, we have a lot of organizing to do. We are being killed left, right, and center by so many issues domestically that we tend to do not a good enough job of organizing ourselves so we can work together across different political spectrum, across different kinds of organizations, across different turfs, so that we can be able to battle this monster more effectively at home. And this monster has a budget of $1 trillion. It's a $1 trillion military-industrial complex in the United States that has with it think tanks and politicians and intellectuals that push to find nails to supplement their hammer kind of thinking. And we need, on our side, to be organizing so effectively and so productively and so powerfully that we ones to frame the topic rather than being the ones to try to reframe the topic. And we can do it because there's so many connections. I'll give you just one and we'll end on this one. We know JSOC is operating in Syria. Okay? We know JSOC is operating without congressional oversight. We know JSOC is also operating in more than 40 countries around the world, according to Jeremy Scahill's excellent documentary, Dirty Wars, and his excellent book, Dirty Wars. We have this JSOC. JSOC is also operating, by the way, in South America, in Latin America, where it works on the so-called war on drugs, which has nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with money and repression. We connect those two, we bring them back at home. Who do we have here that's being imprisoned and incarcerated, allegedly for drug crimes that are nonviolent? Significant percentage of our population, the largest incarcerated population in the world. And what do they do when they're in jail? They work like slaves in a plantation. And their work like slaves in a plantation is being done to feed a privatized system that encourages more longer sentences, that encourages that same system that is now getting a direct pipeline from our school systems that are being weakened and destroyed so they can feed the prison system, because we don't need public education. That's what we've got the voucher system for. And we can tie that right together. JSOC is part and party to that. Syria is right here in our neighborhoods. We can connect that, and if we're able to connect that visually in our minds, we're able to connect it organizationally. The way that we organize with prison communities, with civil rights communities, with communities trying to protect our Fourth Amendment from being destroyed by a constitutional lawyer as president, okay? And connect it to people all around the world who are battling under drones and JSOC and their own repression. And it starts with framing it in the right way. And I think if we do that effectively enough, we can get it. And personally, I am hopeful. I'm not hopeful about my region. I'm not hopeful about Syria and Lebanon. I think we're going to go through hell. But I am hopeful about the movement here in the United States for two very simple reasons. The amount of anger I have seen in North Carolina coming from the most repressive and irrational legislature that any state in this country has seen. We have made Texas seem leftist, folks. I mean, North Carolinians, we're going backwards fast as a legislature. And in response, there has been a community of organizing coming out of North Carolina that is taking the state forward and inspiring folks in Texas and Florida. One small example of organizing, where Democrats and Republicans and Libertarians and black and brown and white are standing together every Monday to go, no, not on my turf, you're not going to do this. We connect that, and then I look in Congress, where I've had congressional office after congressional office tell me up front, they have never, on any issue, witnessed such a consensus of anger and outrage from their constituents as they have seen on this issue. The constituents are not divided. The polls may say it's a 60-40. I go to Congress, and I heard more like, you know what, I got 3,000 phone calls saying no to the war, 3 in support. That does not strike me like a 60-40, that's 1,000 to 1. That's the outrage that is right now in this country against the Syria war. Let's use that outrage not only to mobilize it against this war, but to mobilize it against the economic war, political war, civil rights war, all these other wars that we are enduring, to move it from a no to a yes.